Hi everyone, this is Professor Hall. This is not one of the poems that you have on your list for this week, but I wanted to do a short video about how to read a poem. I think one of the problems that people often have when they're first reading poetry is that they read it incorrectly and then the interpretation is extremely difficult. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a traditional poem by Robert Frost. It's called The Road Not Taken. It's interesting because Robert Frost, as you can see here, lived 1874 to 1963. Um, when he was alive and writing poetry, a lot of the other poets were trying to be quite experimental. So around World War One, the modern age, from about 1911 till about 1937 when World War II hit. This is one of the times when he's writing, and the other people who are in literary circles and whose work is getting published are writing these crazy experimental things that I did not assign to you because if I did, they wouldn't make a lot of sense and you would be terribly confused. So, Robert Frost here says, your path is just as fair as mine, and maybe it even has the better claim. It's grassy and it wants wear, but at the same time, I'm going to go this other way. Um, it's a path that not everybody's taking, but I'm a more traditional guy, and this is the way that I want to go. And I think it's interesting because a lot of times this poem gets interpreted as him not being traditional at all, going his own way and marching to the beat of his own drummer. And so that's sort of what he's doing, but he's doing it by writing a traditional poem as opposed to an experimental poem. So what do I mean by that? Well, in a poem, typically we have lines, as we have here. These lines are formed into stanzas. So he has stanzas here made up of lines, and each stanza is 5 lines. And he has one, two, three, four stanzas of um, 5 lines each. The other thing that he does that is a little bit more traditional, as opposed to some of the spoken word poems that you're going to be reading later on, he has a rhyme scheme. So we have wood, which rhymes with stood and could. Both and undergrowth are kind of near rhymes. Fair, where, and there, rhyming. Claim and same. Lay and day and way. And black and back. And that rhyme scheme is the same throughout. So it would be A, B, A, B, and it's continued through each stanza. So there's no playing around with the rhyme scheme. There's no experimentation with having stanzas of all different number of lines. Nothing like that. And then we come to how to read it. And this is where things get kind of tricky if you're new to poetry. And a lot of people, I think, say, Mrs. Hall, I hate poetry. And I think this might be why. If you've never been taught really how to read it, it can be kind of difficult. So if you look, when we read prose is anything that's not a poem, really. So fiction, nonfiction, and not a play either, because it's a little bit different when you're writing in drama. But when we read prose, we have a couple different types of punctuation. The first is a comma. A comma is a brief pause. The second is a semicolon. A semicolon is a moderate pause, and it connects two complete thoughts or complete sentences. So we have one here, and we have another one here after where. The third type of punctuation is a period, and then we have two exclamation points and question marks. And periods, exclamation points, and question marks are full stops, right? It's not just a brief pause or a moderate pause, it's a full stop. And if you look at this poem, I'm going to highlight a little bit here for you. This entire thing, up into the word black, is one long sentence. He has a complete thought here, in the first stanza, another complete thought in the beginning part of the third stanza. It is connected to, it doesn't really matter what the name of it is, but it is connected to a dependent clause here. And then we have another conjunction here, the word and a final dependent clause. So he has several clauses and phrases put all together like one long sentence. Then, and this is kind of interesting to me, he has a very short sentence right here, and then a little bit longer of a sentence, and then kind of a moderate one down below. So when you're reading, you have to sort of think about these things. Where is the punctuation? How long are the sentences? How long are the phrases? And this is traditionally how I have heard people read this. This is how you don't want to read a poem. They will end and have a pause after each of these end words here, particularly when there's rhyme. So here we go. Don't do this. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for the passing there, had warned them really about the same. Now, I've heard people do this many a time, and you notice it's quite awkward. There's a lot of emphasis on the last word, which emphasizes the rhyme, but kind of throws off the rhythm that the author is trying to create. But more than that, this whole part right here is connected to this part right here. So um, the other path that he's talking about is referred to here with it. And if we read the sentence, let me click out of that, there we go. If we read the sentence without the proper pauses, we don't understand where it is connected to, right? And what is grassy and what wants the better claim or has the better claim. None of that makes sense. Now, if I read it where I take brief pauses here, moderate pauses here, and then I come to an end stop here, it makes much more sense. So I'm going to read it here for you. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler, long I stood and looked down as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for the passing there had warned them about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. So, sorry about the crazy highlighting. My mouse isn't quite working here, but I think you can hear the difference, right? I'm going to read just just this part, after the semicolon. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. So you can hear hopefully a little bit of the rhythm. He often mimics kind of like horse beats with his rhythm, and you can hear that a little bit better. You also, I hope, can see how this part of the stanza connects to this part of the stanza. We have a comma and a conjunction, but this whole idea is connected here. And they're worn the same and leaves no stress. They're worn them this. They are worn the same, really about the same. And leaves no step had trodden black. So you can kind of see here they're equally laying, and the idea of being worn and trodden are connected. But if you read it incorrectly and you make the wrong pauses in the wrong areas, you don't really get that. So we're going to go over now to another poem, a little bit less traditional. This one is by Lucille Clifton. Um, so, if I read it incorrectly and pause at the end, um, I need to know their names. Those women I would have walked with, jauntily the way men go in groups, swinging their arms, and the ones, those sweating women who I could have joined after a hard game to chew the fat. What would we have called each other laughing? Now, again, you can kind of hear, and I think a little bit better, maybe because this is a little bit more modern poem. Um, the sentences are a little bit hard to distinguish because she is non-traditional poet and she doesn't have punctuation the same way that other poets might. But if I read it a little bit differently and connect some of her ideas the way I read, um, we have an end stop here, a little bit of a pause here, end stop, pause, and an end stop. There's only one internal pause, which is right here. So, if I read it again, here we go. I need to know their names. Those women I would have walked with jauntily, the way men go in groups, swinging their arms. And the ones, those sweating women who I would have joined after a hard game to chew the fat. What would we have called each other, laughing, joking into our beer? Where are my gangs, my teams, my mislaid sisters? All the women who could have known me. Where in the world are their names? Especially here, it's to me this is a powerful poem. Especially here though, um, if I pause after with, then this description, jauntily the way men go in groups swinging their arms, is kind of lost. Same thing if I end in groups, right? So if I read this whole thing up until where she has put the pause, I'm going to highlight it and I'm going to read it again. I need to know their names, those women I would have walked with jauntily, the way men go in groups swinging their arms. There we go. Now we have our first full portion of this poem. So I think that you can kind of see. The next part is the sweating women after a hard game, joking into the beer. The gangs, the teams, the mislaid sisters, then is all together. And then the women who would have known me, where are their names? Um, again, as a separate thought. This is all one stanza. Um, so it can be a bit harder to read, but if we break it apart that way, we can hear what her intention was a little bit better. So I'd like you to think of this when you're reading the poems that I've assigned. The spoken word poems in particular are really interesting to listen to because of the flow that the poet has decided to use. Look in those. I'll have another video about those, but look in those for differences in rhythm. I kind of read these all in a in the same rhythm, and a lot of times the poems with spoken word they'll have a part that goes slow to emphasize a point, and then a part that goes a little bit faster to make you think and make your brain work a little bit, or change up the tone to make it a little bit funnier. And then they'll slow it down a bit, and then they'll speed back up. So it's kind of interesting. Poems, really, I think, are meant to be read out loud. This is an oral form of communication, and the first poems were told orally and were memorized. And so, if you are reading them, um, look at where the pauses are and try to read them out loud until it's a little bit smoother for you. And then you can kind of dig into their meaning. So that's it. I hope you guys learned something from this, and I'll enjoy reading your stuff online later.